Um, well, I'm happy to be here with you all today. As Cornell said, the topic of my talk today is Goldilocks, going beyond Goldilocks, and navigating the 8 worldly winds, which is a teaching of the Buddha that I'll go into in this talk. But the theme of Goldilocks has been floating around in my subconscious for a very long time as I practice meditation. And finally, I decided I'm going to give this talk on Goldilocks. Um, and there's a great philosopher, I don't remember who it was, but he said at some point we will get old enough to where we'll be able to read fairy tales again. So normally we see fairy tales as being maybe a thing for children, but now that I have a small baby, I've been reading stories to her, and I've seen deeper meanings reflected in these stories. I haven't been reading Goldilocks to her, but like I said, Goldilocks has been in the back of my mind, and I think revisiting it and bringing it out in the context of mindfulness meditation can be really beneficial. So what I'm going to do today is start by reading the story of Goldilocks. It's pretty brief, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So I'm going to read this story, and then I'm going to ask for some reflection as to what do you all think the moral of this story is? What do you think this story is trying to tell us? And form a bit of a discussion question at the beginning. So let me pull this up. This story is on AmericanLiterature.com, and it's Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So here we go. Once upon a time, there were 3 bears who lived together in a house of their own in a wood. One of them was a little wee bear, and one was a middle-sized bear, and the other was a great big bear. They each had a bowl for their porridge, a little bowl for the wee bear, and a middle-sized bowl for the middle-sized bear, and a great bowl for the great big bear. And they each had a chair to sit in, a little chair for the little wee bear, and a middle-sized chair for the middle-sized bear, and a great chair for the great big bear. And they each had a bed to sleep in, a little bed for the little wee bear, a middle-sized bed for the middle-sized bear, and a great bed for the great big bear. One day, after they had made the porridge for their breakfast and poured it into their porridge bowls, they walked out into the wood while the porridge was cooling, that they might not burn their mouths by beginning too soon, for they were polite, well-brought-up bears. And while they were away, a little girl called Goldilocks, who lived at the other side of the wood, had been sent on an errand by her mother, passed by the house and looked in at the window. And then she peeped in at the keyhole, for she was not at all a well-brought-up little girl. Then, seeing nobody in the house, she lifted the latch. The door was not fastened, because the bears were good bears who did nobody any harm and never suspected that anybody would harm them. So Goldilocks opened the door and went in, and well pleased was she when she saw the porridge on the table. If she had been a well-brought-up little girl, she would have waited till the bears came home, and then perhaps they would have asked her to breakfast, for they were good bears, a little rough or so, as the manner of bears is, but for all that, very good-natured and hospitable. But she was an impudent, rude little girl, and so she set about helping herself. First, she tasted the porridge of the great big bear, and that was too hot for her. Next, she tasted the porridge of the middle-sized bear, but that was too cold for her. And then she went to the porridge of the little wee bear and tasted it, and that was neither too hot nor too cold, but just right. And she liked it so well that she ate it all up, every bit. Then Goldilocks, who was tired, for she had been catching butterflies instead of running on her errand, sat down in the chair of the great big bear, but that was too hard for her. And then she sat down in the chair of the middle-sized bear, and that was too soft for her. But when she sat down in the chair of the little wee bear, that was neither too hard nor too soft, but just right. So she seated herself in it, and there she sat till the bottom of the chair came out, and down she came, plump on the ground, and that made her very cross, for she was a bad-tempered little girl. Now, being determined to rest, Goldilocks went upstairs into the bedchamber in which the three bears slept. And first she lay down upon the bed of the great big bear, but that was too high at the head for her. And next she lay down upon the bed of the middle-sized bear, and that was too high at the foot for her. And then she lay down on the bed of the little wee bear, and that was neither too high at the head nor at the foot, but just right. So she covered herself up comfortably and lay there till she fell fast asleep. By this time, the three bears thought their porridge would be cool enough for them to eat it properly, so they came home to breakfast. Now careless Goldilocks had left the spoon of the big bear standing in his porridge. "Somebody has been at my porridge," said the great big bear in his rough, gruff voice. Then the middle-sized bear looked at his porridge and saw the spoon was standing on it too. "Somebody has been at my porridge," said the middle bear in his middle-sized voice. Then the little wee bear looked at his, and there was the spoon in the porridge bowl, but the porridge was all gone. "Somebody has been at my porridge and eaten it all up," said the little wee bear in his little wee voice. Upon this, the three bears, seeing that someone had entered their house and eaten up little wee bear's breakfast, began to look about them. Now the careless Goldilocks had not put the hard cushion straight when she rose from the chair of the great big bear. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair," said the great big bear in his rough, gruff voice. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair," said the middle-sized bear in his middle-sized voice. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair and has sat the bottom through," said the little wee bear in his little wee voice. Then the three bears thought they had better make further search in case it was a burglar, so they went upstairs into their bedchamber. Now Goldilocks had pulled the pillow of the great big bear out of its place. "Somebody has been lying in my bed," said the great big bear in his great rough voice. And Goldilocks had pulled the bolster of the middle-sized bear out of its place. "Somebody has been lying in my bed," said the middle-sized bear in his middle-sized voice. And when the little wee bear came to look at his bed, there was another bolster in its place, and the pillow was in its place upon the bolster, and upon the pillow there was Goldilocks's yellow head, which was not in its place, for she had no business there. "Somebody has been lying on my bed, and here she is still," said little wee bear in his little wee voice. Now Goldilocks had heard the great gruff voice of the great big bear, but she was so fast asleep that it was no more to her than the roaring of wind or the rumbling of thunder. And she had heard the middle-sized voice of the middle-sized bear, but it was only as if she had heard someone speaking in a dream. But when she heard the little wee voice of the little wee bear, it was so sharp and so shrill that it awakened her at once. Up she started, and when she saw the three bears on one side of the bed, she tumbled herself out at the other and ran to the window. Now the window was open because the bears, like good, tidy bears as they were, always opened their bedchamber window when they got up in the morning. So naughty, frightened little Goldilocks jumped, and whether she broke her neck in the fall, or ran into the wood and was lost there, or found her way out of the wood and got whipped up for being a bad girl and playing truant, no one can say. But the three bears never saw anything more of her. So thank you all for listening, especially to my three voices there. And now I'd like to bow out and ask you all, what do you all think the moral of that story is? What do you think that story is trying to teach us? What elements stand out to you? And how does it apply to our mindfulness practice? So I'll go ahead and bow out. Feel free to bow in and share some responses of what you think that story was about.
I want to say I love this. And to show the just right metaphor in so many different aspects. I remember just but it shows that it's really good to not. There's multiple things, but I'll stick with one, especially for practice, that we can start with where we're at. So not do something that we're more than capable of doing. If we're already sitting for 5 minutes a day, then maybe shoot 6. But don't go for, 30 or an hour. All you done is 5. And so it's a really cool and really interesting application to show, okay, we can still challenge ourselves, but not to the degree that it's too incredibly hard. So finding that happy medium of that's not too much for us, but not too little for us. All right, okay.
Judy.
Judy, bowing in. I think your baby is very lucky to have you as a dad to read bedtime stories. I think she's going to enjoy your entertainment. For me, there are many lessons to be taken away from the story. I'll just share 2 of my thoughts. The first is to be a good neighbor. So we all live in the same community, and so being responsible and respectful of each other's property, and just being mindful to be a good neighbor, I think is a good lesson. And the second thing that struck me is finding the middle path. So sometimes in life is really too easy and we're breezing along and we forget ourselves, and then we may start hitting bumps along the way, and then life gets bumpy, and then we're like, why is this happening to me? Because everything's been so easy breezy all this time. Then sometimes we have times when our life journey is challenging for us and could be difficult or hard, and that would be likened to like the big bear. Everything was a little bit too challenging, a little bit too uncomfortable. But then finding the middle path is, once you've tried the easy way and once you've tried the difficult way, then you forge your own path, or you follow teachings, and then you find the middle path, and that is what resonates with the inner being within yourself.
Thank you all. Would anyone else like to share an interpretation of what you thought that story was about?
Again, I know how to interpret it, and thank you so much, Nick, for bringing that story back into my imagination. But I always find it very interesting that the smallest option was the most perfect option for this child. I don't quite know what that's about, but I just find it very interesting. And it wasn't the middle option that was the most comfortable. It was the smallest option, and also the most frightening option when reality had to be confronted. So that's all I have to offer.
Even though she's a rude little girl, I think there is lessons to be learned that learning is experiential, and you gotta try different way of being. Tuesday Sangha talked about historical Buddha and Siddhartha's life, and how he experienced intensely life, and then of the extreme ascetic life. Through experiencing the full, he could choose the middle path. So, although yes, we should respect properties and be a good neighbor, I think there's also something to learn from not keeping our minds closed from certain emotions, letting yourself experience I always like. Like, to go in and just really do a deep inner listening, what is just right, truth, that nature, what it may be. So for me, so me, I just feel the presence.
Bowing in. It definitely brought to mind one of the precepts in the 5 mindfulness trainings coming in July. You know, the one, I forget the full text of it, but basically the one says don't steal. You know, it's like only use stuff that belongs to you, only possess things that are sort of rightfully yours. And she clearly was not respecting this precept. And as happens when one does not follow the guidelines, it led to suffering. And she was terrified and perhaps died. That was a very interesting ending to the story. She just disappeared. She didn't respect, you know, other people and other people's stuff, other bears and other bear stuff. I think it's so weird that I was grateful for bears. Check it. I don't know. Subconsciously remember this topic. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. It was kind of like, this is what comes from not respecting other people's space and property. Basically, yeah, when you're not a good neighbor, you might jump out a second story window, I guess.
All right, thank you, Paul, for sharing. So now, yeah, I liked what you all had to say about that. As you see, I've become the bear, but let me turn this off actually. So yes, so there's a lot of different meanings and interpretations of that story. Seems like some of the main themes you all said were being a good neighbor, learning how to find respect. I mean, the story starts with Goldilocks breaking and entering, disobeying her parents, breaking and entering, trying out all these things, breaking property, and then fleeing the scene at the end. And so the sense that she isn't very well mannered, she isn't very considerate of what other people's lives, of what's going on in other people's lives. She's kind of self-centered and focusing on what she can get for herself. And so when I first heard that story, I heard one of the kind of habitual tendencies that our mind is always doing. And one of the things that our mind tends to do, according to the Buddhist teachings and also according to my own life experience, is that we always seem to be looking for some kind of pleasure. We always seem to be looking for some kind of satisfaction. And part of our mind wants this satisfaction to be lasting. Somehow, when we look for satisfaction, we want to get the job that we can have for the rest of our lives. We want to eat a meal that somehow will satisfy us for the rest of our lives. We want to have a friendship or a relationship that will be there all the time and that can satisfy us for a long time, forever. But in reality, when we look at things, life is impermanent and it's always changing. And so when we have this attitude of always looking for pleasure and always running away from pain, we're still kind of stuck in delusion. We're still stuck in this state where we're expecting satisfaction to be somewhere in the future, and we keep running after it, and we never quite get there. And that was one of the main themes that I heard from Goldilocks, is this tendency to, I'll even break into a house to try to find this thing that will satisfy me. Even though I'm aware that bears are living there and they could be potentially dangerous, although for some reason the story says they're extremely good-natured and well-behaved, she's still putting herself into this state of danger and almost making these immoral choices as a result of it. So there are many ways to kind of conceptualize or capture this sense of running after something that keeps changing, that's not permanent. And the Buddha talks about in his teachings the 8 worldly winds. And in a minute, I'll go into what those 8 worldly winds are. But when I heard that phrase, the 8 worldly winds, I was reminded of another key story that I thought was a pretty wise story. And that's in the Bible, in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a story of King Solomon, who is one of the richest kings and wealthiest kings in all of time. And he decides with his riches and with his wealth, he's going to seek out satisfaction. So one of the first things he does is he starts this extremely intricate project of building a temple. He builds this massive palace with stunning, pirouetting fortresses. Pirouetting fortresses, that sounds pretty nice. Golden towers soaring into the sky, various inner rooms and fountains. And he expends so many resources to build this beautiful palace. And even though he builds this palace, he still really isn't satisfied. And he says after he builds it, all I was doing was just chasing after the wind, meaning it was just chasing after this thing that was unable to be grasped. So he said, all right, those palaces still didn't satisfy me. I'm going to see about wives instead. So back in that day, he could get up to, there was no limit on the number of wives that he could get. So he decided to go after this conquest, and he gained hundreds of wives and thousands of wives. And he thought that that would bring him a sense of satisfaction. Looking after all these partners, this diversity of experience, this sensual experience that he was looking for. And after he got somewhere around, I think, 8,000 or so wives, he found, wow, I'm still not satisfied. I'm still not really feeling like this has made my life any better or fulfilled my life in any way. And he said that act was still just a chasing after the wind. That's what he compared it to. So he said, okay, if palaces and wives don't satisfy me, maybe what I'll do is I'll go to the cultivation of gardens. So what I'm going to do is create this massive, beautiful garden. I'll see if I can get exotic fruits to grow there. I'll see if I can cultivate the best wines that have ever been created. And I'll see if I can satisfy myself through these sensual pleasures as well, through getting these beautiful sensual things in this garden, and see if that's going to bring me some fulfillment and some lasting peace in my life. So he expends all these resources, hires all these workers, imports people from foreign countries to help him build this beautiful, magnificent garden. And after the garden's built, he said, I'm still not really satisfied. That didn't really do much for me. It didn't fill up my life anymore. He said, after all that, it was just chasing after the wind. So he keeps coming back to this phrase, chasing after the wind. So he says, you know what, I'll try one more thing. And that's the scholarly life. So what I'll do is I'll go to school. I will pursue the highest degrees. I'll pursue many different degrees as well. So maybe I'll pursue 7 or 8 PhDs. I recently read a story in the New York Times about a man who achieved somewhere around 15 or 20 advanced degrees. So he had 15 or 20 master's and PhD degrees. He went to some of the best universities in the United States, Harvard, Cornell, the school that Cornell Kinderknecht owns, at Cornell and these Ivy League schools, and he still found that he wasn't satisfied. And so Solomon, back to King Solomon, he did all of this scholarly research, practice, tried to find fulfillment through studying all the wisdom texts of his tradition and of other traditions as well. He had this very broad-ranging mind, and he found that still he wasn't satisfied. Even after all of his studying, it was just a chasing after the wind. He came back to that phrase, chasing after the wind. And so when we sit in meditation, we breathe in and we breathe out. We see that there's no sense in breathing in and trying to hold on to our breath, trying to keep it as if we desire this breath and we want to hold on to it and be filled up and fulfilled. We have to let it go. If we hold on to our breath too long, we're going to die. It's going to be the end of our life. So we have to let this breath go, and we have to become emptied again. And then we have to breathe in again and we become full, and then we breathe out and we become emptied again. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, also said that when we look at something we desire, it's almost like we're taking in a big breath, and at some point we have to let that go. So whether we desire a higher salary, whether we desire a relationship, whether we desire a vacation or traveling to somewhere, at some point we can take that in, and then at some point we have to let that go. It's just like a breath coming in, and it's just like letting go of a breath. So when we don't see that, that there's a coming and going, that there's a flow to things, we have to keep chasing after these desires in our mind. And so I really like that phrase, the 8 worldly winds, and that phrase, chasing after the wind. So what are the 8 worldly winds? The Buddha talks about this in the sutra called the Lokavipatti Sutta. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I'll go into just generally what it looks like. So basically, the 8 worldly winds are 8 things that when we have our mind of desire that we run after, or we run away from, and try to avoid, and we're kind of stuck in this pursuit of something and fleeing from something at the same time. And that is a state of delusion. So the first 2 worldly winds are gain and loss. So we want to gain things. We want to get more money. We want to get a bigger house. We want to get more friends. We want to get more likes on Facebook. We want to gain. We want to keep gaining things. Maybe we want more esteem among our coworkers. Maybe we want more degrees. And the sense of gain keeps us running and keeps us future focused. It's a sense of desire and it's future focus. Oftentimes, once we gain the thing that we've sought, we're not satisfied with it. There's more, our minds are still stuck in the state of running after something in the future. So even after we get what we wanted, we sometimes don't even realize it, and we just keep going after it. So the second part of that is loss. We don't want to lose things. We want to keep things and have them so that they're permanent and they keep lasting. But that is also a delusion as well, running away from loss. Losing something is in the nature of things. And if we gain something, we have to lose as well. As the Tao Te Ching says, the person that saves a lot will suffer a great loss at some point. So you can look at examples of people that have spent their life in pursuit of the gaining of wealth or something like that. And at the end of their lives, they have to give away that wealth. They can't take it with them. It doesn't benefit them at the end of their lives. Or maybe it does somewhat, but they can't hold on to it after their life is over. So gain and loss are the 2 worldly winds, the first 2 worldly winds that we chase after. The second 2 are status and disgrace. So we want to have status, we want to have a positive standing in our community, and we'll chase after that to the degree that we can. And we also want to avoid disgrace. We want to avoid a sense of dishonor. We want to avoid people looking down on us, perhaps. And this, I think, also might be connected to those complexes that we say in the contemplation before sitting that we're trying to kind of get over. If we have a superiority complex, are we looking for this status so that we can be above others, so that we can see ourselves as better than others in some way? And if we're avoiding disgrace, are we avoiding disgrace so that we don't see ourselves as lower than others? And the Buddha teaches that when we see ourselves as higher than others, and when we also see ourselves as lower than others, this is a state of delusion. In reality, we should look at the oneness of life, the oneness of things, rather than trying to raise ourselves above others or put ourselves below others. The third set of worldly winds, so far we have gain and loss, status and disgrace. We have censure and praise, or also known as praise and blame. So we want to be praised. We want to be told we're doing a great job. We want to be rewarded for our efforts. We want to accumulate the highest number of views on our videos that we put out for the Dallas Meditation Center. We want people to love us in terms of our praise and give us maybe some fame as well. So we want to be praised. We want to get that positive feedback from others. But sometimes if we crave that praise too much, we may shift our genuine nature into something that's not really genuine anymore so that we can continue to get more praise from people. I've read a lot of stories or seen stories of people who become famous on social media, and as a result of their seeking after this fame and this praise and these likes, they become more and more distanced from themselves and from their own kind of inner reality. They become more depressed and more anxious, and their craving for the likes and the praise is starting to take over their whole mind, and they can't find any peace. So the opposite of that is blame. So when someone comes to us and criticizes us or tells us we've done something wrong, we also want to avoid that as well, because that causes us pain in some way. And so there's the idea that some praise me, then why shall I be cast down by blame? So when someone blames us, we can focus on the praise. But when someone praises us, we can also notice that there have been times where we have taken a misstep and we have made mistakes. And when people do censure us or criticize us, it's important to be mindful and be able to take that in. We don't want to just put it aside and say, no, I'm this perfect person, I never make any mistakes. We want to be able to take it in and consider the truth of it if it's true, and try to adapt accordingly. There's a famous saying somewhere in the Buddhist cosmology that the Buddha does not speak out of a need to please people or necessarily make people happy. What he's speaking is the truth, and the truth then makes people happy in some way. It helps to awaken them, wake them up. Sometimes it's like a shock that wakes them up, something they really don't want to hear, but it helps to wake them up completely. His goal is not to get praise. His goal is to tell the truth, to say something that's true. And the fourth wind, worldly wind, the fourth set of worldly winds are pleasure and pain. So we're seeking after pleasure, we're avoiding pain. Just like Goldilocks, she's seeking after this comfortable seat. She's seeking after a bed that is satisfying. She's seeking after a porridge dish that tastes good. And while she's doing this, she's even sacrificing the morality, breaking in, stealing, doing these things in order to seek after pleasure. So we can see that her seeking after pleasure is pretty severe in her case. We also want to avoid pain. We don't want to feel pain. We don't want to experience pain. And so we'll do what we can to get away from pain, also often chasing after pleasure to get to pain, to get away from pain. And so these 8 worldly winds are important to look at with our mindfulness practice. So we have gain and loss, status and disgrace. That's also known as fame and disrepute. We have praise and blame, and we have pleasure and pain. So on the one hand, we really want a life filled with gain, status, with praise, and with pleasure. There's part of our minds that just says, in order for me to be happy, I want a life filled with gain, fame, praise, and pleasure. And then if I have these things, I'm going to be unhappy. If I have loss, disgrace, blame, and pain, I'm going to be unhappy. So we have to go beyond this dualistic way of seeing things and find the middle way through these. So those are the 8 worldly winds that we tend to run after. And I think those are kind of interconnected. When we experience praise, that's a sense of pleasure sometimes. When we experience blame, that's also a sense of pain sometimes. When we feel like we're getting famous, that can also be kind of a superficial level of pleasure and gain, like we're gaining something, we're gaining popularity. And when we experience disgrace, that's also a form of loss and pain. So those 8 worldly winds are interconnected. So how do we get beyond this constant running after something and running away from something else? How do we move past this, and how do we awaken so that we're not caught in this state of always looking? So we'll take a moment to just take some deep breaths and just kind of sit with that question before I proceed. How do we get beyond these states of running after gain and running away from loss? So luckily, the Buddha answered this question. He distinguishes between 2 types of people in this sutra. He says there's one average run-of-the-mill type of person who takes in the gain, takes in the loss, and doesn't see it as inconstant, stressful, and subject to change. He doesn't notice that it's impermanent. So like I said, part of the delusion is that we think that once we get to a certain level, once we get a certain state, that's when we'll be happy, and then that happiness will be lasting, long lasting, and we won't have to do much else. We'll just stay in this state of happiness. But in reality, it's impermanent. There's many charts that say that when someone buys a fancy new car, they expect their satisfaction to go like this, to kind of continually mount and go higher and higher, or at least go higher than it was and then stay at this even high level of happiness. But in reality, when people get a new fancy thing, their happiness goes up for a little bit, and then it pretty quickly goes back down to where it was before. It doesn't make a real significant change or impact on their overall level of happiness. So the run-of-the-mill average uninstructed person, the Buddha says, is the one that doesn't see the impermanence of life. And he says the one that is awakened, the one that is practiced, is the one that sees and recognizes the impermanence of life and does not cling to it. So the run-of-the-mill person clings to it and says, I'm keeping this, I'm going to get more of this, it's going to stay with me. The awakened person says, this is going to change, and therefore I will not cling to it. And if it's a good thing, if it's a gain coming in, I'm gonna just be aware that it's there. I'm not gonna identify myself with it. And I'm gonna know that at some point it's gonna pass away into something else. It's gonna change into something else. Kind of like Cornell was saying when he was introducing our meditation, when we're sitting in meditation, we're just observing our thoughts. If it's a beautiful thought that comes in, that's lovely. We're aware of it. We watch it as it passes like a cloud in the sky. If it's an ugly, intrusive thought, we are also aware of that, and we stay with our breathing and we watch it pass like a cloud in the sky. We simply notice things arising and passing. So the awakened person does not welcome the arisen gain and rebels against the arisen loss, and does not rebel against the arisen loss. He does not welcome the arisen status or rebel against the arisen disgrace. He does not welcome the arisen praise or rebel against the arisen blame. He does not welcome the arisen pleasure or rebel against the arisen pain. As he thus abandons welcoming and rebelling, he is released from birth, aging, and death, from sorrows, lamentations, pains, distresses, and despairs. He is released, I tell you, from suffering and stress. Those last ones were the words of the Buddha. He said, this is the difference, this is the distinction, this is the distinguishing factor between the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones and the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person. His welcoming and rebelling are scattered, gone to their end, do not exist. Knowing the dustless, sorrowless state, he discerns rightly, has gone beyond becoming to the further shore. So when we talk about the further shore, going to the other shore, that's part of the Buddhist teaching as well, getting to a place of peace and understanding of things. But in reality, the further shore is already right here. It's already under our feet. It's already something that's present right now. And that's why we go from seeking after things and going from this mind that's always in a state of desire, future focused, to cultivating that presence that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about. That even just to walk on the earth is a miracle. Even just to walk on the earth is a beautiful thing. And if we can bring ourselves back home to ourselves and return to our breathing and be content with simply walking on the earth and notice the beauty that's already all around us in the light on the trees, in the breeze. There's so many elements that are beautiful and there right in front of us that we can be content and we don't have to run after all these things in our life. I think our society is one that is very consumeristic and it's poised on trying to get us to continue running after these things. As Chuck Palahniuk says in the book Fight Club, he says, we buy things we don't like with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. Or no, we buy things we don't want with money we don't have to impress people we don't like. So that's the element of this consumeristic culture. We're always trying to consume things and consume to become satisfied, just like Goldilocks is always running after things. And even when she gets her satisfaction, the chair falls out, the bears come, she wakes up from her nap, and it's time to keep going. So the element of presence, cultivating that radical presence and mindfulness and ability to be with whatever happens, whether it's pleasant or painful, and persist in really being with it and being still there is an essential part of the practice. And that's how we kind of go beyond Goldilocks. And then just one final point, as we return to Goldilocks, we can see ourselves in the spiritual journey. Maybe we haven't broken and entered into a house of bears, but we have been chasing after these things in our life. And maybe at some point we get that shock, like a bear looking at us that says, hey, this isn't the way. You need to get out of here. You need to get out of this house of looking after and running away from these polar opposite things. And you need to wake up. And so Goldilocks leaves that house. And as she leaves that house, maybe she learns a message. She learns the message that I need to wake up and stop looking for these pleasurable things and running away from the pain, and maybe find a way of being that's more alert and wise than that. And I think her leaving the house and continuing on her journey kind of symbolizes that. Maybe she's learned something from the experience and she's grown as a result of it. So thank you all for sharing, for listening, and for sharing. I really appreciate your presence. And I'll go ahead and bow out and open up the discussion circle.